Welcome everyone again to the DMRC at QUT, and my name again is Katharina Esau, and I'm a postdoc here at the DMRC at QUT. I'm very glad to be the moderator of this first opening session, where we really want to set the ground for all our discussions basically that follow. It makes sense to start and explore what do we mean by the public sphere. It's a very complex concept. So we will explore this together, but I would really like this also to be a conversation between Axel and John. This is something that I'm aiming for. We will see how far I get. And also a conversation between the panel speakers and you all. So I will reserve enough time in the end so that we can really discuss together. And everything basically in this workshop should be, and this is how we envisioned it, pretty interactive. So don't feel any hesitance, jump just in as soon as we start the discussions together. I want to acknowledge again that this is funded by the Australian Political Studies Association. It's a workshop funding that the APSA offers. So this is something that you can apply for every day. And we want here specifically focus on supporting ECRs and HDRs, but also build interdisciplinary links together. To have this discussion, to think about what is the public sphere, I couldn't have more ideal speakers with me here or conversation partners. John is a professor at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance and distinguished professor at the Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis at the University of Canberra. He just published or is about to publish, the newest book comes out in a few days, I think, John. The book is called Deliberative Democracy for Diabolic Times, Confronting Populism, Extremism, Denial and Authoritarianism, so very timely. And it comes out in a few days, but we were already able to have a sneak peek into one of the chapters that I shared with you. Thank you for that, John, and welcome again to the DMRC. We are very glad to have you here with us. Axel. Axel is a professor at the Digital Media Research Center here at QUT, and he's currently an ARC Laureate Fellow, the first media and communication scholar to receive a laureate, with the project Determining Drivers and Dynamics of Partisanship and Polarization in Online Public Debates. So again, a very timely topic. Thank you, Axel, for joining us today and for all your support. So I have a set of questions that I want to ask the panel speakers, and I will start with the first set of questions, which is, we want just to explore and start, and how would you define such a complex concept as the public sphere? What are its parts? Who is part of it? Who is maybe not? How is it structured? And what are essential concepts connected to it that we need to understand the public sphere? And I would like to start with John, please.
The public sphere is a concept that is used in many different ways by different people. As I was thinking about Katharina's opening question this morning, I thought, well, it's certainly a concept with multiple uses. Is it what is sometimes called an essentially contested concept? And I'm not quite sure I know the answer to that. Democracy itself is an essentially contested concept because we couldn't have democracy unless there were contestation about its meaning. And maybe the public sphere is like that, but I'm less certain. And then in terms of how I use the concept myself, as I was rereading the chapter that I circulated to everyone from the forthcoming book, I noticed that we define the public sphere in encompassing terms as the total volume of public discussion in a society. So that, in that sense, there are potentially everyone in a society belongs to it. But I've also used the concept in totally inconsistent ways. So in the sense of something that is separate from the institutions of the state. And I think that is perhaps more in common with the the idea of the public sphere is introduced by Habermas way back in 1962, where he grounded the public sphere historically in terms of a category of early bourgeois society confronting monarchy, theocracy, and aristocracy. So it was an oppositional sphere in which there was public discussion against established centers of power. So I've occasionally used it like that as well. And so I think probably when we're talking about it in that sense, we should always have the adjective oppositional in front of it. So oppositional public sphere is that clearly defined location. So in that sense, it's not all-encompassing. It only encompasses particular kinds of actors in confrontation with public authority. But there's also, I think, a possible intermediate definition between the all-encompassing one and the oppositional one, where the public sphere is, as its name implies, public. So it does involve all kinds of conversations, interactions about politics, but its meaning is not necessarily confronting, but it's separate from the institutions of the state. So those would be at least three ways of using it. And I think they all, I mean, I'm not sure we have to decide on any one of the three, because they all have the use at different times.
Thank you so much, John. I give over to Axel straight away.
Thank you, and I'm so glad you went first, John, on that one. I would add to that, yeah, I'd agree. I mean, the way I think of the public sphere is always as multiple and plural, basically. There are a number of different forms of public sphere that we could easily identify. I would add, I think, to the ones that you've identified, really the mediated public sphere. And that's obviously, as a media and communication scholar, this is something that I'm particularly interested in, the mediation of the public sphere. Some of, as I read it at least, and some of it is very difficult to read, but as I read some of the more recent work by Habermas particularly, there is a strong focus on that sense of the public sphere as the arena for public contestation, for public debate, that the media, however we define that and wherever we draw the lines of what we mean by the media, that the media create. So in a more traditional sense, obviously, mainstream media, broadcast, print media, legacy media, perhaps, as we might call them now, and that's there's a strong sense, I think, of that sort of the public sphere as the arena where public debate is staged by media, by journalism, where we are presenting the arguments of different sides in politics and different sides in society, where those debates are taking place essentially in view of the public, though not necessarily with much direct participation by the everyday people, by the general public. So very often that's more of a set of elites ultimately of media and journalists themselves, of politicians and others who are in some way in the public view debating the issues of the day. And that, of course, from my perspective, is being increasingly challenged as a structure by the shifts in the structure of the media themselves, by the rise over the last 30 odd years of alternative media, of digital media, of social media more recently, and the fragmentation ultimately of audience attention, of participation that's gone along with that as well. So rather than having, and I sometimes sort of think of the sort of ideal in the sense of the mediated public sphere that Habermas might have in mind as sort of the German public sphere of the 1980s, where basically literally everyone watched the one TV news program every night. And that very much was a case of a public arena where the events of the day were being discussed. And there were a number of high circulation newspapers that lots of people were reading as well. That's obviously very much gone. You know, that's fragmented and diversified massively anywhere in the world, not just in Germany. So we're now in a position where we have these multiple publics that exist all over the place, still obviously around some of the legacy media, if you want to call them that, what used to be mainstream media, and their media offerings, both in print and broadcast and increasingly also online, but then also augmented and supplanted to some extent by social media spaces of various forms that also have altered and changed and evolved and mutated over time, of course, from perhaps some of the really obvious spaces like Facebook and Twitter at a time to now what I've heard Joel Roth recently call the Cambrian explosion of social media in the wake of the decline of Twitter and Facebook. So we're now in a position, I think, where there are many multiple publics that kind of overlap in various ways. People participating not just in the one, but obviously in many of them at the same time. You have profiles on 2, 3, 4 social media platforms, for instance. You're also still following some mainstream media and so on. So there's a big combination there of different publics through which information now flows. And I think that's, for me, where we really move from talking about the public sphere to multiple overlapping publics that together perhaps span something that you could still call the networked public sphere, perhaps, or a network of publics, possibly. And that we need to understand, though, also in possibly quite different ways, because then it actually reaches into more non-public spaces as well, where we might find this public or semi-public debate actually taking place, for instance, in closed groups on Facebook, in WhatsApp, in Telegram, in wherever else you want to find it. And so I think the distinction between what's public and what's private is very much softening as well. And of course, we've had 10, 15 years ago, Zizi Papakarisi writing already about the private sphere as not just a totally private space anymore where you were away from the public, but where there is a kind of a discussion going on that also overlaps with much more public discussions. So I think we're starting to see maybe a fragmentation, maybe a diversification of these publics going on. That's sort of my, I guess, mental model that I have now of what's maybe replaced the public sphere, or how the public sphere has mutated, I guess, in recent times.
Thank you, Axel. I will give John a chance to respond to that as well. But before I do that, I wanted to have a follow-up question on the picture that you just painted, Axel, because you write in the communication theory article that I shared, the public sphere is now irretrievably fractured into a multiplicity of online and offline, larger, smaller, more or less public spaces that frequently, and I found this interesting, often serendipitously overlap and intersect. So I was curious about the concept of serendipity here and what you meant by it.
Yeah, and look, one of the things that we've seen in research over and over again, the Digital News Report is a good example of that, because they've shown this a number of times, is that, for instance, very many people, not everyone, but very many people, and particularly people who are not like us in this room, who are in some ways studying politics, news, media, and related topics, but everyday people often don't actually care that much about politics or the news or public affairs or whatever you want to call it. And there is a very significant mindset amongst probably the majority of the population in most countries that news will find them, news will somehow come to them via their various social networks, both online and offline. If something important happens in the world, they will find out about it through their networks. And that's the sort of serendipity, because somewhere in their network there will be people who are actually interested in the news or in politics or whatever, who will talk to them about what's going on, whether that's the voice referendum, for instance, that we've just had, or other topics, the major sort of topics of public debate. So that's the sort of serendipity, really, I'm kind of thinking of, that there is, that we are all obviously embedded in various overlapping social networks. Sometimes there is this kind of experience of context collapse as well, where people who are who were connected with in one way suddenly develop into political activists on some topic that they really care about, and are spamming us with messages about how we really should not take vaccines or whatever. So all of this sort of stuff is going on very much in a kind of wild sense, online and offline every day. That's the kind of serendipity, I guess, I'm talking about. And I thought, just very, very quickly, if I may, I've recently talked to quite a few journalists about, for instance, the impending potential ban of news again on Facebook that's coming as Facebook is moving out of its arrangements with Australian news publishers where they were paying basically some of their advertising revenue to publishers. And part of what the journalists are asking is, well, what's the impact? What's the likely impact of that going to be? And in fact, if Facebook bans news again from its platforms, or Meta does this for all of Meta's platforms, I think it's actually that kind of serendipity, particularly, that's very much at risk, because if news no longer circulates on Facebook, that's still a very important source through which people who don't care about the news actually are informed about what's going on, because someone in their network shares something, and if they can't do that anymore, that's an important stream of news information that falls away basically for people who don't care about the news. That's the sort of the threat to serendipity, in a sense, that arises from an event like that.
Got it, yeah. John, I would like to give you the chance to respond to the picture that Axel just painted, basically.
Well, I don't disagree with any of the picture that he painted. Obviously, Axel's a media scholar and I'm not, so he's much more on top of the sorts of developments that he sketched. But maybe I'll just highlight one thing, that I think historically, and again, this goes back to Habermas, we had this image of a unitary public sphere confronting a unitary state, and the unitary state has perhaps fractured. That people talk about governance rather than government these days, and governance networks that transcend the formal institutions of the state. And then going along that, we have a fracturing public sphere, but we also have transnationalization, in the sense that a public sphere, the public sphere, is no longer defined by the state which it confronts. The publics are transnational, and so this adds an additional layer of complexity, if you like. So there's, well, in other words, there is a lot going on in terms of fracturing in the state as well as the public sphere. And transnationalization on top of all the things that Axel talked about.
Okay, thank you. Then I would jump to my next question, which is what are the key functions? So why do we care, basically? Why do we care about the public sphere? What are its functions? Why is it important for democracy? And here I would like to start with Axel.
I think I've sort of started to talk a bit about that already, really. Obviously, an important aspect of the public sphere, or whatever has replaced it, however it's kind of changed now, is informing the public and enabling the public to participate in public debate as well, of course, not just receiving the word from on high, whether that's from politicians or journalists or whoever else, but actually being involved in public opinion formation, in public decision making on the things that matter to them. So that is for me really the core function. If by participating in the public sphere, or by at least following the public debate that's played out for you on the kind of mediated spaces of the public sphere, you inform yourself about what's going on in the world, in your country, in your region, in your city, whatever else it might be, whatever the level is basically of attention. And that's critically important to democracy, obviously. And democracy can only really function effectively if citizens are informed about what's going on. I think hopefully that's a fairly uncontroversial thing to say. That is the challenge, particularly also with that kind of fragmentation that we've talked about. How do you inform yourself about what's going on in the world? How do you work out what actually matters in what's going on in the world as well? If you have all of these different spaces to choose from, which may present some very different points of view, of course, as well, some very different assessments of what's going on. What happens, of course, if you're paying a great deal of attention to alternative spaces where it's accepted that vaccines are contain microchips or whatever, or where it's accepted that Donald Trump is the second coming, or whatever else it might be. If you're largely getting your information from these kinds of sources, and you're largely influenced in your own decision making by these kinds of spaces, then of course that leads to ultimately societal fragmentation, I think, as well. Because you are then perhaps drawn into ideologies that are very fringe to society overall. So these are, I think, some of the challenges in all of this as well.
John? Yeah.
Okay. In the field of deliberative democracy, the idea of deliberative systems has taken on a lot of currency in the last 10 or 15 years or so. And so the basic idea of a deliberative system is to look at the different political components which contribute to the overall deliberative and democratic qualities of society. And clearly, the public sphere is central to all that. So we can, in deliberative system terms, we can think, put it slightly crudely, that the public sphere is where public opinion gets generated, and in a democracy that's crucial. But the public sphere is also where power can be called to account. So there should be accountability, ideally itself in deliberative and communicative terms, from the institutions of established power, be they national, local, or transnational, to the public sphere. So in that sense, for any kind of communication-centric view of democracy, such as deliberative democracy, the public sphere has to be central. But I'll just mention, there's just one other function that sort of comes to mind, and the public sphere also potentially provides a venue for people to live their political lives and to find meaning in that kind of interaction. That was stated in perhaps in somewhat extreme form by Hannah Arendt several decades ago, where she spoke of the idea of public happiness. And this is something that you can find in interaction with other people about public affairs. I mean, it was very idealized, and does that actually correspond to anything empirical in the public sphere? I think that's a bit more dubious. But if we look around at the public sphere today, I think we find a lot of public unhappiness as people. Maybe this is an aspect of polarization, I don't know, but people are often mobilized by, in terms of anger about what's happening, and outrage at not just, at what somebody like Trump is doing, for example. So who is finding happiness, public happiness in Hannah Arendt's sense? I'm not sure. Maybe the people at a Trump rally, as they get carried away in the moment, are these people finding public happiness, or is that something else? So anyway, I think that's an open question as to whether public happiness exists. But I think I think Arendt's ideal does crystallize the idea that the public sphere is not just functional for the system as a whole or for democracy as a whole, but also potentially it has meaning for the people, an important meaning for the people who participate in it.
Thank you, John. Yeah, at this point, I think exactly with this happiness argument that I find super intriguing, I would like to give back to Axel as well, because often if we imagine these angry or unhappy people, we imagine them online, right? We more rarely imagine them offline as we do with the online world. So I'm curious what you think about this, Axel. How happy is the online public?
Look, I'm not sure I'd really even draw so much of a distinction between online and offline anymore, because these things are so interwoven, of course. I mean, if you're at a Trump rally, in some ways you're both online and offline. You're offline, you're in the moment, you're in that event, but you're also quite likely taking photos, taking videos, sharing them on your various social media platforms. You might read about it before and then afterwards and so on. You might rewatch even some of the craziest statements he made or whatever. So there's all of that going on. So these things I think are quite interwoven, and often the kind of the offline manifestations of publics that we see are driven, of course, by online activism possibly, that actually gets people out to these events as well. So I think the online-offline distinction I'm kind of less worried about in that sense. But I think, picking up again on what you said as well about public happiness, I do think that, for instance, people who are at a Trump rally or at any kind of mass manifestation, and I've always liked in some of the Romance languages what we call demonstrations here are manifestations. I think that's actually in some ways a much better term, because it's a public made manifest by coming together on the streets or in a rally or wherever else. And these kinds of mass manifestations to some extent are, in fact, they might be angry about something. They might be angry about Joe Biden, or they might be angry about the dismantling of Roe versus Wade, or they might be angry about police violence against black people in the US, or whatever else it might be. But there is also in a sense of togetherness, of community, of joy even in being able to stand up, for instance, against the state or against whoever they think is oppressing them. And that is actually a form of public happiness in that sense as well for those communities. Sometimes that's very pro-social and it's trying to create change in society for the better. Sometimes it's highly antisocial and it's trying to exclude others from society. So it can go both ways. But for the group itself, that is a manifestation of public happiness for that particular group. And that's, and I mean, I'm kind of looking here at Sebastian as well, because we've talked a lot about political fandom and anti-fandom as well. And this is really, I mean, there isn't necessarily a great difference between a Taylor Swift concert and a Donald Trump rally in that they're all coming together in this public event that they all feel very strongly about, and they participate and engage and are kind of together in the moment and are sensing themselves as being together in the moment. Actually, probably something more than just a public, which is a bunch of people kind of attending the same thing and interested in the same topic, but actually a community. And that to me is actually something quite profound. Again, sometimes it's for what perhaps most of us would consider pro-social causes. Sometimes it's very much for antisocial, exclusionary, polarizing causes, of course. But it is that sense of community that I think brings people together, whether online or offline, and often both.
Yeah, I don't want to let it just sink in here, but would still like to give John again the chance to react to that, because I think, elaborating again on going back to Hannah Arendt, what this all has to do with each other would be interesting if you want. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it is, again, I think this is something worthy of empirical investigation, the degree to which some people do find happiness in standing up with like-minded others. And it wouldn't, I mean, not just a Trump rally, but I'm thinking of things at the opposite end of the political spectrum, like Extinction Rebellion or whatever. So that's, I think, well, again, sort of worthy of empirical investigation.
I absolutely agree. Then over to my next question, which you touched already on. Through talking about why is the public sphere important for democracy, we touched on basically also where are moments where we are afraid that something's not going right. So my next question would be, what are the crucial challenges that we are currently facing? What are you most concerned about? And maybe also at the same time, do you have solutions? Not easy.
Okay, that's, I mean, it's hard to know where to begin. Again, sort of just referring back to my forthcoming co-authored book on deliberative democracy for diabolical times. I mean, it sets out a whole series of challenges. Well, where do I start? I mean, it's never been easier, I think, for people to express themselves politically online and perhaps offline as well. And so there's so one problem is a surfeit of expression and a corresponding absence of reflection. And there's actually did a paper on this with Selene Ercan and Caroline Hendricks a few years ago. And so it's not necessarily the low quality of expression that's a problem, but there are fewer opportunities, fewer reflective. Well, another way of looking at it is that there are fewer reflective spaces in deliberative systems that there might be, and then this can actually be powerful actors can actually try and overwhelm the public sphere with expression and reduce reflection. So there was an article in the American Political Science Review in 2017 by Gary King and others, in which their account of the Chinese government-sponsored social media, the basic point of the social media deluge that the Chinese government engaged in is not to counter opponents or critics or argue against them. It's just a deluge of expression to distract the public from potentially awkward issues. So that's, I think, an extreme example of an overload of expression, meaning that the possibilities for reflection get marginalized. But we've got a long list in the book. I'll just list things and not talk about them in any detail. Lack of argumentative complexity, simplistic slogans, as opposed to, I mean, there's nothing wrong with being simple, but being simplistic slogans when it comes to things like the Brexit referendum in Britain, for example. Misinformation and lies. Again, Brexit exemplifies that. Just was dominated. The No campaign was dominated by misinformation. Disregard for minimal standards of truth and logic. So that, I mean, Trump would be an exemplar there, of course. Online incivility. Again, that's probably no need to elaborate. And then an extremist media ecosystem which didn't used to exist. So pioneered by Fox News in the US, of course, where Murdoch media sort of figures out how to just to make a lot of money from fomenting outrage, essentially. And so you've got this what's sometimes called the extremist media ecosystem. It may be watched directly by a relatively small number of people. So there's an article by Druckmann and McLean in 2018 who suggests that only about 15% of people in the US actually attend to the right-wing extreme media. But then the problem is that those 15% then interact with a much larger number of people. So the problems it creates are magnified. So those are, those are just a few of the issues. I mean, there's a longer list, but perhaps that's enough to be going on with.
Yeah, thank you, John. I just I follow up maybe on this one to keep kind of the problems and the solutions together. To John, back to John, and referring to your new book where you argue that it is citizens reflective. This is what you touched on, capacities in combination with macro level deliberativeness. What you are especially, I guess, hopeful about, that this is something that we should aim for. And here I wondered, what do you mean with macro level deliberativeness, especially if we think about different types of institutions and media included, I guess.
Right. So the macro level there is, the idea is that we should hold whole systems encompassing the public sphere and formal institutions of government, social movements, media, and so forth. We should be looking for deliberative qualities at that kind of macro level. And that might sound uncontroversial, but in the deliberative democracy field, there are people who pin all their faith in one particular kind of institution. And often that is, there's been a lot of enthusiasm for so-called mini-publics. I know some of you are familiar, not all of you necessarily, but mini-publics are essentially chosen. They're relatively small bodies of more or less randomly selected citizens who deliberate together on an issue, often produce some kind of report or recommendation at the end. And there are some people who, the extreme view is that these should be institutionalized as systems of government. The extreme view is that these should actually replace some elected institutions of government. That's putting all one's faith in one particular kind of institution. The more systemic approach, as I say, looks at the deliberative qualities of whole systems. And then, so what do we do to promote those deliberative qualities? We can think about the place of institutional innovation, such as mini-publics, but in more systemic terms, in how they can contribute to the deliberative qualities of the system as a whole. But we can think about other sorts of practices, institutions too. So we can look at the role of social movements, for example, My co-author Andre is very big on the idea of democracy activism, where it's political activism on behalf of democracy itself. So not just pursuing a cause within democracy, but actually promoting democracy as a cause. So in the Czech Republic, for example, there's a movement called Million Moments for Democracy, which we talk about. So in other words, there are multiple. We should think about the contribution of multiple institutions and practices to the renewal of the deliberative qualities of democracy in the light of the threats to it. And there are all kinds of things that matter. Some other things that I didn't mention. The role of leaders and performances matters enormously. There's a project which Selene and Jordan, who are here, are also involved in on democratic resilience, which looks at the responses of leaders to political shocks. In the specific cases that we're looking at, to extremist attacks, and the performances of leaders in response to those attacks makes an enormous difference in terms of whether it's sort of creating division in society or potentially healing across division. So there are, again, important to focus on the whole system, looking at the role of diverse actors, practices, and institutions within that system. Not just in isolation and looking at the deliberative qualities of particular acts or institutions or practices in isolation, but looking at in terms of how they all fit together. And what can I say? Read the book.
Thank you, John. I hope there's something left over, Axel, but I'm sure there is.
Yeah, I mean, look, I agree with all of that, and I'm really looking forward to the book as well, because I think that's a really important argument to make. I would add to that, again, coming from a media and communication perspective, perhaps a little bit more discussion also of the platforms upon which all of this takes place in the mediated parts of the public sphere, obviously. I want to be really careful here, because so often the simplistic argument is actually that, yeah, since we've had social media, everything's fallen apart, and social media is killing democracy or whatever. All of us have heard this argument in various forms, I'm sure, over the last 10, 20 years now. And I think that's deeply problematic and is really just techno-determinism. And in fact, we've had these same arguments when the radio came along, when TV came along, when the internet itself came along, and then when social media came along, probably before that even when writing came along. In fact, there were arguments like that when writing became a mass medium as well. So these arguments are nothing new, and they're always deeply problematic. Where I do want to make an argument, though, that this deserves greater attention is the operators of platforms. And that's actually both the sorts of newish emergent platforms that we've come to know as social media, but also, of course, more traditional platforms, again, like legacy media, like print and TV. And I think part of the problem that we've probably really always had, in fact, in the public sphere is the influence and often the outsized and unpoliced, possibly, influence of the providers, the operators, the owners of these various platforms. Whether that is, in a more traditional sense, someone like Rupert Murdoch or the media barons of the US in the 1920s, or of Germany, for instance, in the 1930s as well, that were promoting the particular types of perspectives that were benefiting their particular business or ideological interests, or whether that is now the Mark Zuckerbergs and Jack Dorseys and, God help us, Elon Musks of this world, who are operating the platforms where a lot of the current public debate takes place. So I think that's, and this is not a new argument, but even quite powerful and successful and resilient democracies have often failed to appropriately police, I think, the power and influence of these media operators. We're seeing that probably around the world, really, with the very ineffective press councils that exist, for instance, that very often just provide a slap on the wrist for really quite problematic media coverage. We're seeing this with the often very flailing attempts to police social media platforms as well. I mean, in Australia, again, we're going through a bunch of these sorts of things at the same time at the moment with the News Media Bargaining Code and whatever that will mutate into now, with efforts to curb hate speech and other forms of problematic information on these platforms, with efforts to even generate some more transparency. So that, I think, is one of the areas that is one of the greatest policed, under-legislated, under-solved, if you like, areas, I think, where we need to do a lot more to ensure that meaningful, reasonably fair, balanced, equal public debate can actually take place and is not affected by the whims of, for instance, Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk, who just doesn't like a particular account and has them suspended, or introduces some sort of approach to moderation that benefits their interests but not democracies or not the general public's. So I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done there. A lot of that also requires for us, of course, to demonstrate the problems that exist. And there again, we have the problem that, if anything, our ability as researchers to demonstrate, to document, to highlight the problems that exist is more and more limited because of the more and more limited access to platform data that we have. Perhaps the region where legislation is most advanced with this is the EU, and particularly with the Digital Services Act and some of the provisions for data access that are coming in there. Some of the other work that's happening around, there, that may help us as researchers gain more access to empirical data that enables us to then say, you have a problem with hate speech, abuse, misinformation, disinformation, blah, blah, blah. But so often it is the platforms who are basically judge and jury of these things and are operating in an entirely untransparent way. And that to me is a very significant problem. But again, it's not just social media alone. It is actually mainstream media as well. I mean, Katharina and I could tell you a very long story about how difficult it even is to get reliable access to large-scale news data. What are mainstream news outlets even publishing? That is in itself actually not a trivial question. Although we've had news databases in libraries for decades, but they're often very limited and again, not very accessible at scale in order to really understand, well, how is the Australian media landscape covering climate change, for instance? So there's a very significant problem that with transparency that benefits ultimately the interests of the media operators, both legacy and social, digital, whatever. And ultimately that lack of transparency is not of benefit, obviously, to the functioning of a robust democracy.
Thank you so much, Axel. That's the perfect bridge over to the next question, which was basically, how do we research this complexity of public sphere that we are facing there, the hyperconnectivity, information overflow, different ideas of, I guess, what quality is. How would you propose, which methods do we need? Where do we lack maybe something? What do we need to build to do that?
We do it with difficulty and in a very piecemeal kind of way at this point, necessarily so. And that's not a criticism. That's just the reality. It is very difficult to really get a more comprehensive picture of the public sphere or the network of publics or whatever we call it. So that is simply a massive challenge for all of us. We do need to do it ultimately with mixed methods. There is a role for basically all of the methods in our arsenal. My work and our work for quite a few of us in the Digital Media Research Center has been very much taking a data-enabled, I'm not going to say data-driven, but certainly data-informed approach that ideally looks at large-scale data on both media activity and social media activity and everything in between, that can be very useful, but it is very beholden to the kind of data access that we have, and it often ends up shining a spotlight on the particular platforms, the particular areas where we do have good data, and has a lot of blind spots where we don't. So we need to extend that and need to find ways to, and probably find innovative methodological ways as well, of course, to study some of the platforms and some of the spaces that traditionally we haven't had great access to. And now we're starting to really, our access tends to reduce to most platforms anyway. There is an important space also away from that more maybe quantitatively informed approach for deep qualitative methods. There is increasingly a push now away from, or augmenting, I guess, the data that we can raise for data donations from ordinary citizens. We've had a very successful project, for instance, that has encouraged people to donate data on the ads that they see on Facebook in order to push past the very severe limits that the Facebook ad library itself has, so that we can better understand how are people actually being targeted by advertising, both political as well as commercial, and for particularly for problematic products like tobacco and alcohol, for instance. So there's data donations, I think, that are important. That's on the data side. There is, of course, also very much a role for interview-based and ethnographic and survey-based work that tries to understand from a different perspective how people experience the media landscape that they're in, the media repertoire that they're using, what strategies they themselves have for actually navigating this terrain, and the work of your Canberra colleagues, I guess, at the News and Media Research Centre, with the Digital News Report, and as part of the global Reuters Institute Digital News Report work, for instance, which is very survey-based, is also incredibly useful, incredibly powerful for understanding better the trends in the way that people inform themselves, the sources that they rely on as they do so, the way that they're engaging with that and with each other as they do so, and the continuously changing kind of media, new media, social media landscape that they navigate as they go about their business as citizens of a democracy. So all of that needs to come together, and that's not even all of it, obviously. That's just some of the areas that I'm particularly interested in, but all of that actually needs to come together to form that bigger picture. If we're really talking about the public sphere overall, or the network of publics overall, then this is not one research approach or even one discipline alone, but it is very much a multidisciplinary effort that involves a large number of researchers using a very diverse range of methods.
John, over to you, because I mean, you are known for your theoretical work, but also for the work, the empirical work that you and your team are doing really on the ground, I would say, with citizens. How would you say which methods do we need? What is lacking as well?
Well, I think certainly everything that Axel said about the need for multiple methods, combining qualitative and quantitative research, I think I would agree with. So maybe I'll just mention two things which Axel didn't, and put in perhaps a pitch for them. So yeah, Katharina, as you said, that in my own work, in some ways at heart I'm a political theorist and a democratic theorist in particular, but also I think that it's really important to do empirical work, and do empirical work in dialogue with democratic theory. So what does that mean? Well, it means using democratic theory as a critical perspective on the way the world works. What is it? What exactly is it we're trying to seek in democracy? As deliberative democrats, it has a lot to do with meaningful communication, encompassing citizens, leaders, and others. It needs to be inclusive of all relevant categories of people, but also relevant discourses, and it needs to be consequential in actually making a difference. So we can use that as a kind of if you like, a theoretical template for the scrutiny of what's actually happening in real-world democracies, in the public sphere in particular. But we can also use empirical results the things that we find in order to rethink the theories. So in terms of, well, we can look at what does deliberation mean in practice? What kinds of forms of communication do we actually find? How do they lead us to rethink what the theoretical ideals? So there's that kind of, if you like, that kind of dialogue between democratic theory and empirical research is I think, a really important one to sustain. And I think that's really at the heart of what our centre does. The other thing I'll mention is, which is perhaps a bit more problematic, and that's comparative history. Now, 21 years ago, I did a co-authored book with David Schlossberg, Christian Hunold, David Downs, and Hans Christian Hernis, and it was called Green States and Social Movements. And then the subtitle was Environmentalism in the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, and, sorry, what's the fourth country? Oh, Norway, of course, yes. Anyway, those four countries were chosen because they represented a particular ideal type of relation between the state and the public sphere. And so what we did was we looked at the comparative history of the relationship between the state and the environmental public sphere over several decades, leading up to around 2000, which was when the research finished, and trying to think about the different patterns, the different patterns of exclusion and inclusion which states created, the implications of those for the public sphere, and the vitality of the public sphere. And there was some, we thought, some surprising results. In the way the state was structured had some counterintuitive results. So inclusion, welcoming all interests into the state, was not necessarily good for the public sphere, because it led to co-optation, de-radicalization, the loss of critical voices in the public sphere. So I was going to, my first thought was, well, okay, I can applicate that as a method. However, today I think it's much harder. Why is it harder? Because it's less easy to speak of a unified state adopting particular patterns of inclusion or exclusion, and it's less easy to think of even if we sort of narrow it down to say the environmental public sphere and look at only environmentally relevant aspects of the public sphere. There's much more fragmentation, but also interchange across national boundaries. So if you look at something, well, a movement like Extinction Rebellion, for example, it's not nationally specific. I mean, a lot of the communication is transnational, so it doesn't really sort of make sense to look at it, say Extinction Rebellion in the UK or Denmark or wherever in relation to the British state or the Danish state. And so that kind of comparative history now becomes much harder. And I don't know. I don't know. I'm not sure it necessarily means we should abandon it. We just have to think harder about how to do it. But anyway, all that's saying that there are even more methods out there than the ones Axel listed.
Great. And I guess with this, I would open up the discussion to all of us. We have still plenty of time because we started pretty early. So yeah, we will move the microphone to you. So just raise your hand and I will come to you. Tarek? And I will leave it with you, and then if you could.
Thank you very much for the talk. I have a question for Axel and one question for John. For Axel, in the perspective of the deliberative democracy, we are guided by certain normative ideals about what we should aim for, what we should aspire for, and what the public sphere should look like. In my view, this also means something to dream about and something to fight for. You mentioned that it doesn't make sense to talk about a singular public sphere because of fragmentation, but yet in your discourse, you highlight several problems with this fragmentation. Should we aim for a more communal or shared public sphere, or do you believe that any form of normativity does not make sense. And for John, reflecting on the idea just shared about empirical research informing theoretical and normative perspectives, can you think of a significant change in your theoretical perspective in recent years that was influenced by empirical evidence? And how did this perspective look before, and how does it look like today?
So I might start then. Thank you for that. That's a really good and a very difficult question. In some ways, I mean, yeah, what you're asking is kind of what ideally would this look like? I mean, obviously, you can have perfectly good deliberation in each of these sort of sub-publics that might exist in the network of publics. But of course, these could be very fringe or even extremist publics where there is perhaps deliberation going on perfectly from a normative kind of sense, perfectly functional deliberation going on, but they're deliberating about how to best hate on this other group that they're hating on, or how to best agitate for some very fringe and anti-democratic cause. And so within that group, it might be, yeah, there might be very, very good patterns or very functional patterns of deliberation, but ultimately the aim of that public is still deeply anti-democratic and deeply problematic. So there isn't an easy answer, I think. I think if we're thinking about the network of publics overall, what is in the first place, I think, important is that, yeah, these do not fragment to a point where they kind of exist purely in isolation from each other, where there is this sort of kind of clandestine kind of sense of individual publics pushing their own various agendas. What we still need is somewhere at the center of all of this, maybe not a mediated public sphere in the kind of classical mainstream media sense, but at least a connection between and an engagement between the representatives of these individual publics to work through the differences that they have, and if not find consensus, then at least develop compromise and develop a way to be able to live with each other, even though they might have very different opinions of a particular matter or whatever. And I'm not sure that we have a good mechanism for that to happen at this point. I think, if anything, the trend over the last few years, and perhaps particularly since sort of the double shock of Trump and Brexit, has been that more and more we have these individual publics within which people gather, who are, and I want to be really clear there, because that's something, obviously, as you know, I've written about. These are not isolated from each other in the sense that they don't know what the other side's thinking. They're very much aware of what the other side's thinking. They're just not really engaging with each other in any kind of meaningful way. You'll have the Trump fans and the Biden fans, and they're very clear on what the others are doing and saying, but they're not obviously trying to resolve their differences in any kind of way. You've got, in the moment in the US, sorry for all these US examples, but you've got the debate about abortion rights, for instance, and we've got to a point where the compromise that existed, which was Roe versus Wade, has been dismantled, and you've got increasingly just the hardcore of what we call, I think in both cases, problematically pro-life and pro-choice groups, that are ossifying in their positions, and there's no really meaningful attempt anymore, and it's not incentivized in any way by the political or media or whatever other systems either. There's no attempt anymore to resolve this and come to some form of compromise, return to some, nationwide solution that actually everyone can live with. So I think the problem is that across these individual publics, there is, I would say, I think, but I haven't got the empirical data, there's a decline in cross-public communication or attempts to engage in a meaningful sort of way. There is more antagonism, less agonism. Sorry, looking at this and there. That is going on there, and nothing in either the political system, which is now even more deeply polarized than it ever used to be, and in the media system, nothing is incentivizing essentially for these groups to come together and say, hey, look, it can't go on like this. We've got to find some new solution. And of course, many of the organs of state that might have facilitated that, whether it's the presidency or the Supreme Court or other bodies, are also deeply compromised and are no longer able to play that role as bringing these different sides together as a more or less neutral arbiter. So I think that's part of the problem. And this is an extreme case. The US is always going to be the extreme case, I think, with politics. But there is, I think, there are signs of these sorts of patterns elsewhere as well. Perhaps we're just seeing one emerge in Australia with the religious discrimination debate that's about to kick off again. Perhaps we've seen it, well, I think we've certainly seen it with the voice debate as well. So there is little incentive at the moment for people representing these different publics that have different points of view, simply different discourse groups, I guess, that have different points of view, to actually come together and have a meaningful debate aimed at finding, if not consensus, then compromise. Sorry, that's a bleak view, but yeah, it's the only one I've got.
Okay, in terms of an example of rethinking political theory ideals in light of empirical engagement, in some senses, the whole trajectory of the theory of deliberative democracy over the last 30 years or so, I think, reveals that. So if we can find, again, anything I say will be a bit stylized and probably self-serving. But if we think of, say, one of the classic articles back in 1989 by Josh Cohen, which established, one of the foundational articles of the deliberative democracy field, he was basically applying Rawls in a very Rawlsian fashion. And so it dealt in ideals. There were no empirical reference, and the ideal was something like Rawlsian public reason. And so deliberation was really a manifestation of arguing in completely impersonal terms, in terms of principles that should apply to everyone. That was challenged initially by theorists such as Iris Young. Actually, Lynn Sanders was an empirical scholar, not really a theorist, but who pointed out, and the argument was, and they deployed a bit of empirical evidence, not very good empirical evidence, that this privileged the speaking style of particular dominant groups in society, sort of well-educated white males in particular. And then this was investigated using sort of, I think Young and Sanders relied mostly on studies that were done in a non-deliberative settings, or jury studies, or things like this. And then with time, the theoretical ideals got reformulated. And so there's, in the introduction to the Oxford Handbook of Deliberative Democracy, published in 2019, 2018. Anyway, there's a table in there which kind of contrasts, and it's a slightly simplified table. It's really Jane Mansbridge's table, which contrasts two generations of deliberative theory. And if you compare the two tables, then a lot of what you find on the right-hand side is a result of rethinking the theoretical ideals in light of empirical studies. And so there's an openness to self-interest, for example, but not in terms of just any pursuit of self-interest being okay. I mean, it's conditional in terms of being able to be sort of linked to more universal concerns. There's a recognition of different, well, rather than just using reasons, which Cohen would have done in his 1989 article, we can think of considerations in support of or against particular positions. So there's a whole series of reformulations. And that's one. And I'll just mention another. Actually, I've got an article written with Simon Niemeyer that's currently, it's been under review at the Journal of Politics for almost a year now, I think, and haven't got the referee supports yet. But anyway, it takes, the idea of epistemic injustice is that epistemic injustice arises when the when the positions or communications advanced by particular groups are disadvantaged on the basis of the ascriptive characteristics of whoever who's making the who's making the argument. So that was the additional idea of epistemic injustice, and it was articulated as a theoretical ideal. And what we've done is actually, as a result of, I won't go into it takes a long time to explain Simon's empirical method, but what we found in doing some empirical research is that there's actually a disjuncture, a systematic disjuncture between what people can internalize and what can be expressed in public. So it arose entirely from empirical investigation. And then I think I'd been reading the literature on epistemic injustice something separately, and it occurred to me this was actually a kind of epistemic injustice, which essentially it was an obstruction between the values and beliefs that people held and the preferences they expressed. And this was something that it came out of an empirical analysis, and it involves it doesn't actually involve a complete rethinking of what we mean by epistemic injustice, but it does involve an additional kind of epistemic injustice to the sorts that have been originally recognized in the theory. It is a matter of injustice because it's experienced by some groups more than others. So generally by less educated people, but it is also correctable through a process of deliberation. So anyway, that's two examples.
I would say, because we don't have too much time actually left, I would collect two questions. So we go with you, Brooke, and then we take another question in right now.
Okay, thanks. Axel, your description of the public sphere as being multiple and plural sounds a lot to me like what commons scholars refer to as polycentric systems. These are systems that consist of multiple centers of decision-making that function autonomously or semi-autonomously, and that operate under a shared system of norms and rules and across multiple and overlapping scales. I'm curious, have you engaged in any of this scholarship? Do you think there's anything there that you can draw in to help inform some of these, what we're finding in today's society?
I will take one more.
So whoever envisioned this program with eminent political scientist and media scholar, thank you, because I really want to ask this question. I want to make a comment, however, preface it by saying there's a big difference between a Taylor Swift concert and a Trump rally. The Swifties are supportive, and they are largely, predominantly female, mothers and daughters often going to them, at least in Australia, where Trump rallies are characteristically very antisocial with different groups, and there's very little that's uniting them other than their unhappiness. So I'm quite serious in saying, I think that's a brilliant insight about Hannah Arendt and the idealized public happiness, and maybe your next book can be on public unhappiness. But my question is, because I will admit to being a software engineer and coming from that discipline, then doing a PhD in political science, international studies, where I came across your work on deliberative democracy, and now I'm in the field of media and communication, pretending to be a scholar in that area and teach it. Words I don't hear is discussion around things like the influence of lobbyists or hidden and non-elected leaders, corporate capture in the US that has entirely captured digital platforms, and nor do I ever hear about the Patriot Act, which is a big freaking deal, and it's actually an acronym, and I just looked it up. Patriot Act in the US that was put in post 9/11 is the Uniting and Strengthening America by, here's the P, providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism act. That's what Patriot stands for. And what that meant was it was open season for the intelligence community to be able to go around all the institutional controls that were in place to get information on non-US persons, and then it eroded into the sphere of US persons through platform companies. And I just don't hear enough about that. And it's like a tsunami behind, that's the backdrop for everything we're studying. Like we're on a little island and we're observing what's happening on our little island. And in the meantime, there's this big tsunami that's influencing everything we do and the platforms we use by two nations, the US and China, produce the technologies, TikTok and other, Weibo and other platforms, and then the other platforms that we're probably more generally familiar with that are predominantly English. So I just, since we have a political scientist, want to ask you about what you think the influence of the Patriot Act and the intelligence community is on allowing all this to be unfettered, and then the proposed, not ban of TikTok, but not devolution, what's the word I'm looking for? Sale of TikTok by ByteDance, should they wish to continue and serve a US audience or Western audience? Sorry, that's a multi-layered question.
Thank you. Maybe I'll start and respond to Brooke. Thank you for that. And yes, I think there are quite a few overlaps, and I've not done a great deal of work, but I have done some work, of course, in that sort of space of user-led content creation and coordination, and that goes into some of the open source and commons-based approaches as well. You're right. It is very much I guess the picture I'm painting is very much a polycentric picture. I'm less sure about the centers of power, to be honest, because that is still negotiation, and sort of actually connecting a bit with Bernard's questions. It's kind of a negotiation between the power that's inherent in the communities and the power that exists in the platform operators that provide the spaces for these communities to come together and to do the things that they do. So where the power lies, I think, is an interesting question. But again, there probably are multiple centers of power and struggles actually between different types of power that exist: the platform power versus the community power versus state power and whatever else. I've always quite liked thinking of these kinds of polycentric spaces. The term heterarchical as an alternative to hierarchical. So a structure, clearly a structure that exists, but that has multiple rather than just a single sort of pyramid structure with a single kind of person at the top or group at the top. So something that is more diversified in terms of who actually is responsible, or who has power. And I think certainly many communities actually end up operating in that way, where there is a kind of a central core to the community, but it in itself is diverse to an extent and in different communities in a very different way, and is almost constantly negotiating essentially the distribution of power within that core group as well. So I've always been fascinated by these dynamics of communities in that respect as well. And of course that has a very long history going back to, for instance, Nancy Baim's work on fan communities on Usenet well before the web, and other studies like that showed the dynamics of these sorts of online communities in various forms of virtual communities, as we used to call back then. So I'm interested in the dynamics of this. I'm interested in how, if they stick around for long enough, that can evolve and either perhaps ossify into genuine hierarchies of activity, or actually use that sense of heterarchical kind of diversification as a strength as well, as something that builds resilience, I guess, against platform or other forms of attempts to suppress them or oppress them. Again, having said that, much of this in some ways is kind of value neutral as well, because this happens as much in far right, white supremacist communities as it happens in progressive support communities for minority groups, for instance. So this is kind of, again, and I would push back a little bit, but we haven't got the time. I do think there is still a lot of similarity between pro-social and anti-social communities in the way that they operate, just for very different reasons and with very different aims, obviously. But yes, you're absolutely right. I think that sense of polycentrality, multicentrality, and that distributed structures, I think, is actually very important. And at the moment, of course, we do have this sort of real-world experiment going on with something like Mastodon, for instance, as a distributed network with multiple centers or with no center, in a sense, as an alternative to a very highly centralized commercial social media platform. And frankly, we'll see how it goes. I've been on one of these before in the 80s on FidoNet, which was a BBS network, which again worked in a very similar way, actually. And it worked to a point, but it also fell apart as soon as things like AOL and the early sort of major commercial options came along, because they just had the power to innovate much more easily than a bunch of enthusiasts in a loosely network structure had. So we will see, but I think that kind of return to a distributed network is something quite interesting and worth our analysis as well. And maybe I'll leave you to respond more, probably to Bernadette.
Yeah. Okay, the importance of corporate control. In a sense, corporate influence in democracy is nothing new. But I'm thinking back to Habermas's original account of the structural transformation of the public sphere, that one aspect of the decline of the early bourgeois public sphere was the commercialization of the media. There's a long tradition in political science of looking at the influence of corporations on the outsized influence of corporations on public policy, and clearly that's an ongoing problem. So I mean, there's two problems there. One is the influence of corporations on government, both direct in the form of the massive resources that corporations can expend on lobbying compared to all other interests. The second one is the fear of all governments of losing the confidence of the market, and so their first concern must be to keep the market and keep corporations happy. So those are two major sources of corporate power. And then the third one is I suppose the more direct influence on the public sphere, which is control. The control that big corporations like Meta, and then Elon Musk, and I suppose the Murdoch media, and how they can they don't have to sort of work on government. They can work directly on the public sphere. So you put all those things together, and corporate influence is massive. And I think it is sometimes. I know in my own field of deliberative democracy, it is sometimes. It's. I mean, I think everyone knows it's there, but then people and scholars, and including myself on occasions, just proceed as though it's not, as though we can pursue a democratization project without addressing corporate power, whereas I think clearly we cannot. And then in terms of the Patriot Act, I'm not sure what to say. I mean, clearly, thinking back to 2001 and everything that happened in its wake, clearly there was it wasn't just a Patriot Act, but also just in terms of the performances of American political leaders. It was the idea was that there were going to be all kinds of restrictions on what could be said and what couldn't. And so George W. Bush saying, "You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. There is no in between." So that's I think a combination of both formal restrictions such as the Patriot Act, but also more informally the kind of the way that the rhetoric of political leaders, not just Bush, but on the Democratic side too, really sort of tried to redefine the bounds of legitimate expression in the public sphere.
And we are pretty much out of time. So let's keep these conversations in our break. Let's keep talking. Thank you so much, Axel. Thank you so much, John. This was pretty deep, pretty good straight away.